The first time she saw the diary, it was tucked in the shadows of an abandoned attic, wrapped in dust and a silence that felt like it had been waiting for her. The moment her fingers brushed the leather, a shiver crawled down her spine. Something about it wasn't right. It hummed with an energy that whispered, "Do not open me." But she did. Inside, the pages smelled of decay, of secrets long buried, of truth too heavy to be spoken aloud. The handwriting was jagged, frantic, almost alive, as if the pen had been guided by something other than a man's hand. Each word she read pulled her closer, deeper, until the room around her dissolved into the darkness of his thoughts. This wasn't a diary of ordinary life. This was a map of obsession, of forbidden knowledge that no one was meant to possess. It spoke of rituals performed behind closed doors, of silent witnesses who never left, and of a corruption so deep, it devoured everything pure in its path. She didn't just read it, she became part of it. Every sentence planted a seed of unease, a question she couldn't unask. Who else knows this? And what have they done? By the time she reached the first third of the diary, she realized she was no longer an outsider. She was complicit, simply by knowing. And that's the first truth the diary demanded she face. Knowledge is dangerous. Not because it frightens you, but because it transforms you. Every secret it revealed rewrote her perception of reality, until the world she thought she knew, friends, family, city streets, felt like a lie laid over a rut she could never unsee. Somewhere in that attic, as the shadows leaned closer, the diary almost laughed. Not with words, but with a presence that left her heart racing and her mind screaming. She should have walked away. But she didn't. She never would. And that's how it begins, the descent into truths that the world fights to keep buried. The diary didn't waste words. It began with a name, a man no one remembered, a shadow who existed at the edges of power. According to the pages, he had built a network of influence so secret, so meticulous, that even those who wielded authority bowed without knowing why. She read how he controlled minds, not with threats or violence, but with subtle manipulations, whispers that planted obedience before the victim realized they were listening. What terrified her most was the evidence that these manipulations were ancient, ritualized, passed down through generations like a virus. Each entry detailed ceremonies disguised as social gatherings, where allegiances were extracted from those who thought themselves free. And in every ritual, there was always one rule: knowledge is the currency, and ignorance is the leash. The diary spoke of ordinary men and women drawn into impossible choices, of brilliant minds broken, not physically, but mentally, reshaped to serve a hidden agenda. And the horrifying thing, she recognized some of these names. People she thought were pillars of her city. People she trusted. It wasn't paranoia. It was proof that power doesn't announce itself. It consumes quietly. By the third page, she noticed the pattern. The diary wasn't just recounting events, it was teaching her. Every story, every confession, every atrocity was designed to awaken a part of her that had been asleep. It demanded awareness. It demanded reckoning. And it dared her to imagine herself walking the path of the initiated, the burdened, the corrupted. The attic seemed to close in. The air grew thick, pressing against her lungs like the weight of the secrets themselves. She realized, in a sudden, piercing clarity, once you know, you can't unknow. Once you peek behind the curtain, the world you thought was solid reveals itself as a stage, and everyone, every friend, every stranger, is either a player or a pawn. And she wondered, had she stumbled into the diary by accident, or had it chosen her? The diary didn't hesitate to show her the mechanics of control. Its pages described the methods used to bend people's minds, rituals disguised as games, conversations crafted to plant doubt, obedience extracted through fear carefully hidden beneath civility. Every word was a blueprint, a warning. The world is not as it seems, and the people you trust may already be instruments of someone else's will. She read about a man who orchestrated entire cities without stepping into the light, a figure who preferred influence over visibility. His diary chronicled the collapse of families, friendships, even nations, all executed with surgical precision. Not through violence alone, but through shaping perception, twisting desire, turning loyalty into a weapon. And it terrified her because it was so intimate. She could feel the fingerprints of his control on lives she knew. People she had loved, unknowingly puppeteered. But the diary didn't stop at power. It revealed obsession. It spoke of a hunger for knowledge, for dominion over the human mind itself, a hunger so profound it consumed morality. The man's ambitions were not for wealth, not for status. They were for a subtle tyranny that no one could see, until it was too late. He called it the art of silence, and the diary made her understand that silence was not absence, it was the ultimate weapon. Secrets controlled everything, and as she turned the pages, she began to see the personal cost. There were confessions here, written in ink darkened by guilt, remorse, and something more dangerous, pride. Pride in shaping the fates of those who never suspected. Pride in knowing that by the time the world realized, the deed was done. The diary taught her that corruption is never loud. It whispers. It insinuates. It waits. And then it devours. By the time she set the diary down, she realized her heart was racing, her mind stretched thin. The attic had become a crucible of fear and revelation. She knew, with an almost unbearable certainty, that she could never return to ignorance. She had crossed a threshold, and the diary was already inside her mind, teaching her its cruelest lesson. Knowledge changes you. Always. The diary began naming acts that were almost too monstrous to imagine. Ordinary towns, quiet homes, all infiltrated by invisible hands. People vanished without reason, marriages crumbled, careers destroyed, all orchestrated from the shadows. The man who wrote these pages did not simply commit crimes. He curated chaos, selecting individuals to rise or fall, not for talent or merit, but for how easily they could be manipulated, broken, or made to serve. She read confessions of manipulation that chilled her blood. Friends turned against each other. Siblings severed by lies whispered just loud enough to be believed. Children used as pawns in games that were centuries old. Each passage revealed a psychological precision, a cruel artistry that made cruelty invisible, elegant, almost respectable. And yet, beneath the craft was obsession. The diary didn't hide the thrill the author felt in bending reality to his will. He chronicled it with a detached pride that made the reader complicit simply by turning the page. By now, the lines between horror and instruction blurred. The diary was teaching her how to spot the manipulators, how to anticipate their moves, how to survive in a world where power thrived on secrecy. But it was also tempting her, seducing her with the idea that knowledge itself could be wielded like a weapon. And the terrifying thing, she could feel the pull. The attic felt smaller, as if the walls themselves leaned closer to hear her thoughts. She realized that curiosity was no longer innocent. It was dangerous. And then she found the entry that changed everything. A personal betrayal written in meticulous detail, naming someone she knew intimately. The diary didn't just tell stories of abstract horrors. It catalogued the sins of people she trusted, proving that no one, no bond, no place was safe from this hidden power. And she understood, with a clarity that felt like a blade, that this diary was more than a record. It was a map of a hidden world, and she had stumbled right into it. For the first time, she felt fear, not for herself, but for the world as she thought she knew it. Everything was built on lies, everything controlled, everything manipulated. And in the silence that followed, she realized the diary had claimed her, just as it had claimed every mind it touched before. The diary shifted then, away from personal manipulation and into history, hidden history. The pages spoke of shadows behind empires, secret councils that dictated wars, famines, and revolutions, all unseen, all unrecorded by the official narratives. She read of kings and generals who thought themselves rulers, yet were nothing more than instruments, their strings pulled by invisible hands. History, it seemed, was a lie written by those too powerful to be named. The author traced this influence back centuries, detailing rituals performed by societies that the world had forgotten, or been forced to forget. Bloodlines intertwined with occult knowledge, passing down control like inheritance, teaching each generation the subtle art of shaping perception. The diary painted a terrifying picture. Human civilization was not chaotic. It was curated, meticulously guided by forces who understood human nature far better than the humans themselves. And it wasn't just political. It was cultural, spiritual, psychological, art, religion, philosophy, all carefully designed to instill obedience, fear, or desire at precisely the right moment. The diary argued that what humans believed was free thought was often nothing more than pre-programmed responses, tested and refined over millennia. She felt a cold certainty settle over her. She had been a product of this system, just as everyone else had. shaped and nudged in ways she couldn't even remember. The pages hinted at something wise. These forces weren't merely content with guiding humanity. They sought transformation. Individuals of certain aptitude were selected, drawn into secret circles, trained in techniques of influence and control that blurred morality, law, and conscience. Those who succeeded became invisible predators, wielding power without acknowledgement, mastering people as easily as breathing. And some, the diary suggested, had no intention of stopping. By the time she put the diary down again, a weight pressed on her chest. Knowledge was no longer just dangerous, it was transformative. To read this diary was to awaken to the hidden architecture of the world, to see the strings everyone else missed. She understood that even stepping away now would not save her. The diary had begun its work, and the world, she realized with a grim clarity, would never feel safe again. The diary no longer spoke in vague warnings. It began naming structures, organizations, secret societies, even charities and think tanks, that were fronts for something darker. Every entry described layers of influence stacked like a chessboard, with pawns unaware they were playing a game they could never win. She read of leaders manipulated from birth, groomed to serve unseen agendas, their choices predetermined long before they understood ambition. What unnerved her most was the precision. The diary outlined psychological tactics so refined they were almost invisible. Words planted carefully to trigger doubt. Images and symbols embedded in art, architecture, and media to guide thought without conscious awareness. Human behavior could be predicted and redirected with the accuracy of a clockmaker. Every page revealed the terrifying truth. Nothing about daily life was random. Every desire, every fear, every loyalty had been curated. And then, the diary spoke directly to her, as if aware of her presence. It instructed her to mark a phrase, to speak it twice, to lock in a shift in perception. It wasn't superstition. It was a test of awareness, a way to measure whether she could fully internalize the truth she'd uncovered. A phrase repeated, not out of belief, but as an act of acknowledgement. I see beyond the veil. I see beyond the veil. Saying it aloud didn't just engage the mind. It bound her attention, made her complicit, and aligned her consciousness with the hidden reality the diary revealed. Her hands trembled as she whispered it, twice, the words feeling heavier with each repetition. The attic felt colder, and the shadows longer. In that act, she understood something profound. The world as she knew it was gone. She had declared her perception to be awakened, and there was no turning back. Knowledge wasn't a shield, it was a weapon, and she had just drawn it. And the diary, patient and unyielding, continued to watch. The diary did not allow comfort. It revealed the cost of knowing. Awareness, it said, comes with a price, isolation. Once you see the hidden currents of power, the invisible strings, the manipulation behind every gesture, every smile, every decision, you can never return to ignorance. Friends appear as strangers, institutions as cages, and even your own thoughts become suspect. The diary warned her. The mind that awakens too quickly risks breaking under the weight of truth. She read accounts of those who had followed the path before her, men and women of brilliance who discovered what lurked behind society's polished facade. Some vanished, erased quietly, leaving families and reputations intact but memories hollow. Others remained, but not as themselves. The diary described them as shadows of people, bodies inhabited by minds forever altered, living with knowledge too vast to integrate. Their eyes, it said, betrayed recognition of the world's hidden machinery, a recognition that could never be unseen. And then the diary revealed something intimate. Her own patterns, choices, even fears, mapped almost before she had realized them. It documented how curiosity leads to obsession, obsession leads to risk, and risk attracts attention. The hidden forces she had begun to perceive did not forgive mistakes. Every observation, every insight, every attempt at understanding was now a signal, a breadcrumb in a system designed to notice, to react, to control. The diary's voice grew sharper, more insistent. Knowledge, it whispered, is not neutral. It demands transformation. It tests loyalty, endurance, courage. Those who resist it fall into despair or madness. Those who embrace it become something else entirely. And for the first time, she felt the claustrophobia of understanding. The room was too small, the air too thick, and the shadows aware. By the end of that night, she realized the truth of the diary's cruelest lesson. Once the veil is lifted, fear is no longer optional. It becomes a constant companion, a reminder that the world is designed to deceive, to manipulate, and to harvest the unwary. And she, now awake, now altered, was already under its gaze. The diary shifted again, from the personal to the systemic. It exposed structures built to hide themselves in plain sight. Governments, religious institutions, corporations, each a facade, each a mechanism of control refined over centuries. The author wrote of alliances so secret they left no trace, of councils convened in shadows where decisions that shaped millions were made without scrutiny. She began to understand, power doesn't seek approval. It seeks compliance, silently and relentlessly. Every entry detailed methods of influence designed to manipulate perception. Education, media, even art and architecture were instruments of obedience, guiding society's thoughts without overt force. Symbols hidden in plain sight shaped desires, fears, and loyalties. People believed themselves free, but they were not. Every choice had been anticipated. Every rebellion had been foreseen, and the strings adjusted long before anyone realized they were dancing. The diary revealed the human cost. Brilliant minds coerced into complicity. Families torn apart by invisible pressures. Communities silently rearranged to serve agendas beyond comprehension. And she felt the cold realization, this wasn't chaos. It was design. Every catastrophe, every scandal, every seemingly random event was part of a pattern she could now see, and once seen, could never forget. And yet, the diary's voice was almost intimate, whispering lessons with a subtle command. Knowledge is not merely a shield, it is a weapon. To survive, one must learn not only to see, but to anticipate, to navigate the invisible currents of power, to recognize those who pull the strings before they strike. Those who fail are quietly devoured. Those who succeed inherit the burden of truth. By the time she closed the diary that night, she understood the full weight of its teaching. Institutions are never neutral. They are battlegrounds for unseen forces, arenas where obedience is extracted and rebellion punished with precision. And she had crossed into the world where seeing meant vulnerability, knowing meant responsibility, and the shadows she once ignored now watched her in return. The diary's pages became darker, more precise. It described ceremonies performed in secrecy, often hidden in plain sight, festivals, rites, even religious observances twisted into tools of influence. Symbols were everywhere, carved into stone, painted in frescoes, embedded in architecture. Their purpose was simple yet terrifying, to condition the human mind, to channel behavior, to normalize obedience without anyone realizing they had been trained. She read of gatherings that masqueraded as social or religious events but were actually tests. Individuals were observed, evaluated, sometimes mocked. Subtle cues measured loyalty, attention, susceptibility. The diary detailed the outcomes. Those who failed were quietly removed, their absence explained by accidents or coincidence. Those who passed were recruited into deeper layers, taught the language of manipulation, inducted into knowledge so potent it reshaped morality itself. And the symbols, they were everywhere. An arch here, a pattern there, a hand gesture, a phrase repeated in ceremony, all calibrated to influence thought. The diary argued that humans are predictably programmable, susceptible to repetition, ritual, and hierarchy. Generations of societies had been subtly guided by these designs, producing compliance disguised as culture, devotion disguised as faith, and loyalty disguised as tradition. The more she read, the more she realized the terrifying consistency across centuries. Patterns repeated, not by chance, but by intent. Kings, emperors, religious leaders, scholars, they were all conduits, willingly or not, of a system that transcended time. And the diary made clear, knowledge of these patterns changes perception. Once seen, the world no longer feels safe. The familiar becomes suspect, every gesture and ceremony a potential instrument of control. By the end of this section, the diary had accomplished its cruel work. She was no longer just an observer. She had begun to understand the architecture of manipulation, the coded language of power, and the terrifying patience of those who built it. Awareness, the diary seemed to whisper, is both a gift and a curse. And she felt the weight of both pressing down like shadows in the attic, waiting for her next move. The diary grew relentless. It began recounting the fates of those who dared to resist, those who glimpsed the machinery behind society and refused to bow. Some vanished quietly, erased from records, from memories, as if they had never existed. Others suffered slowly, broken by isolation, public humiliation, subtle psychological torment that left their minds fraying, their identities unraveling. The punishment was never random. It was a lesson, a demonstration of control so precise it became almost artistic in its cruelty. She read stories of betrayal that cut closer than she expected. Friends turned to enemies overnight, allies became spies, and every gesture of kindness carried the potential for manipulation. The diary described the psychological mechanisms in vivid detail. Fear used to calibrate obedience, guilt to ensure loyalty, confusion to prevent resistance. Humanity itself was the experiment, and the stakes were nothing less than survival, sanity, and the soul. And yet, she noticed a pattern. Those who survived, those who endured, were not stronger. They were more aware. They learned the rules of the hidden game and adapted. But adaptation came at a cost: emotional detachment, moral ambiguity, a constant suspicion that even the people closest to them were part of the design. The diary implied that awareness alone was not protection, it was initiation. Once you saw the system, you were enrolled, whether you wanted to be or not. By the time she set the diary aside, she could feel the weight of countless unseen eyes. The stories were not just historical, they were instructions, warnings, blueprints for navigating a world that had long assumed she would remain blind. The diary demanded vigilance, cunning, and endurance. It demanded that she understand one immutable truth: power does not forgive ignorance, and knowledge carries a price that cannot be bargained with. And in the quiet that followed, the attic felt alive, almost sentient, as if it had been waiting all these years for someone to reach this stage. She realized she had crossed a threshold. Once crossed, fear is no longer optional. It becomes a companion, a guide, a reminder that the world is not what it seems, and that seeing it clearly may be the most dangerous act of all. The diary no longer spoke of isolated acts. It revealed systems embedded in flesh and blood, patterns passed down through generations. Certain families, certain lineages, were carriers of knowledge so potent it reshaped their understanding of morality, loyalty, and power itself. These bloodlines were trained, groomed, and initiated into secrets designed to manipulate not just individuals, but entire societies. And the diary made one thing terrifyingly clear: the corruption was genetic, intellectual, spiritual. It lived in the mind as much as in the body. She read how rituals, symbols, and teachings were encoded into these families from childhood, carefully calibrating perception, reaction, and allegiance. Intelligence was nurtured not for wisdom, but for control. Empathy was refined to serve influence rather than compassion. The diary described experiments in shaping thought, conditioning behavior, and harnessing fear, all disguised as education, tradition, or moral guidance. The invisible instructors of these bloodlines were ruthless, patient, and precise. And then the diary turned its gaze on her. It explained the machinery of the mind, how suggestion, repetition, and ritual could bend perception and loyalty, how trust could be manipulated, how fear could be used as a tool rather than an obstacle. Every human, it said, was a system to be decoded. Knowledge of these mechanisms wasn't neutral. It was transformative and dangerous. Once understood, one could see the patterns behind every gesture, every word, every institution. But understanding also made one a target, a participant in a game too vast to comprehend fully. By the end of this section, she realized something profound. Corruption wasn't a moral failing. It was a curriculum. The world's structures, from governments to religious orders, were built to perpetuate this knowledge, to cultivate obedience, and to selectively empower those who could master its lessons. And as she closed the diary, she felt the undeniable pull. Awareness was no longer optional. To turn away was to be left behind, powerless in a system that never sleeps. The attic felt colder now, the shadows longer. The diary had done more than teach. It had awakened her. An awakening, she understood, always comes at a cost. The diary's pages became almost obsessive with detail, cataloging symbols hidden in plain sight, glyphs carved into stone, cryptic patterns woven into tapestries, phrases repeated in sermons and literature. She learned that these were not mere decorations or artistic flourishes. They were instruments of influence, coded to trigger emotions, shape thought, and guide behavior without conscious awareness. Architecture itself became a teacher. The placement of holes, doors, and altars designed to impress hierarchy, obedience, and reverence into the human psyche. Language, too, was manipulated with precision. Words were chosen not for clarity, but for compliance. Sentences structured to instill doubt, obedience, or desire. Stories told in ways that subtly conditioned morality, loyalty, and faith. The diary described how governments, religions, and educational institutions weaponized language to create patterns of thought, ensuring that citizens learned to self-regulate, internalizing the control rather than resisting it. The diary went further, revealing how repetition and ritual intensified the effect. Festivals, ceremonies, and communal events were calibrated to reinforce obedience, instill awe, or normalize hierarchy. Even mundane acts, salutations, dress codes, architectural proportions, were carefully designed to shape perception. She realized with growing horror that humanity was molded by these invisible forces for centuries, often without conscious recognition. And yet, the diary whispered a dangerous truth. Understanding these mechanisms conveys power. Once the code is seen, one can read the intentions behind gestures, the subtext behind laws, the manipulations hidden in culture. But with that understanding comes responsibility and danger. To perceive the hidden architecture of control is to become a participant, a target, and a potential master. By the time she set the diary down, her perception had shifted irreversibly. Ordinary streets, buildings, and conversations now appeared laid with intent. She understood the subtle tyranny she had ignored all her life, and as the shadows in the attic stretched, she knew the descent had only just begun. Knowledge was no longer neutral. It was alive, and it had claimed her mind. The diary grew darker still, recounting stories of minds stretched beyond endurance. It spoke of men and women who glimpsed the machinery of control and could not return to ignorance. Their brilliance became a curse. Knowledge that should have enlightened instead tormented, each revelation corroding their sense of reality, leaving them adrift in a world that seemed both familiar and alien. Some were consumed by paranoia, seeing manipulation in every gesture, every glance, every word. Others sank into despair, realizing that freedom had always been an illusion, that their choices had been anticipated and orchestrated long before they were made. She read of obsessive scrutiny, the compulsion to decode every interaction, to map every influence, to anticipate every hidden agenda. Those who attempted it alone often failed, driven to madness by the sheer weight of comprehension. The diary described the methods used by the architects of control to prey on this vulnerability: isolation, subtle suggestion, orchestrated doubt, and the quiet erasure of allies. Resistance became not just dangerous, but almost impossible. Awareness, it said, without guidance, was a trap. And yet, the diary whispered that some survived, not by luck, but through adaptability, cunning, and ruthlessness. They learned to navigate the invisible currents, to attain insight into armor, to anticipate deception before it struck. But survival came at a cost: moral ambiguity, emotional detachment, and a permanent awareness that every relationship, every institution, every act could harbor hidden intent. Humanity itself became a labyrinth of threats and opportunities, and mastery was the only way to endure. By the time she closed the diary that night, she could feel the heavy pulse of its lessons in her own mind. Fear had transformed into vigilance, curiosity into obsession, and understanding into both weapon and burden. The attic seemed to breathe around her, as if alive with the memories and strategies of countless minds before her who had either succumbed or survived. And she realized, with chilling clarity, the descent into forbidden knowledge was irreversible. Once the veil is lifted, the mind is forever altered, and the shadows of manipulation are never truly left behind. The diary shifted again, tracing its fingers deep into the past. It spoke of conspiracies older than empires, older than written law, hidden networks that shaped civilizations from their foundations. Kings, prophets, generals, scholars, all were pawns in a game played over centuries. The diary claimed that no event in history had been truly spontaneous. Every revolution, every war, every rise and fall was orchestrated to maintain control, to consolidate knowledge, to manipulate human perception of reality itself. She read about secret councils that convened in darkness, recording every decision and action, predicting societal shifts with frightening precision. Bloodlines were groomed for specific purposes, alliances crafted across continents, and rituals embedded into culture to maintain the illusion of freedom while ensuring obedience. Religion, commerce, and politics were all instruments of influence, invisible levers pulling at the masses without their awareness. And it became personal. The diary suggested that these ancient systems had observed her, her family, even her thoughts. The realization was suffocating. She was not merely reading history. She was confronting the living legacy of these hidden forces. Each page implied that human consciousness itself had been engineered to respond to the will of those who understood these truths. Awareness was not just dangerous, it was transformative, making the observer both participant and target. The diary detailed patterns repeated over centuries, leaders groomed to fail, societies nudged toward conformity, disasters timed to eliminate dissenters, knowledge hidden behind layers of ritual and narrative. And in every case, the architects of control remained unseen, unchallenged, immortalized in myth and memory while manipulating the course of humanity with clinical precision. By the end of this section, she could feel the weight of history pressing down, the shadows of countless orchestrated events settling in her mind. The diary had revealed that civilization itself was built on secrecy, and that those who truly understood the patterns could either be destroyed or ascend. And in that knowledge, she realized, the descent into forbidden truth was no longer a story, it was a destiny. The diary turned its focus to the masses, revealing methods of control that were invisible, omnipresent, and devastatingly effective. Entire populations had been shaped by subtle psychological warfare, rituals disguised as festivals, education designed to mold obedience, entertainment crafted to normalize distraction, repetition, and acquiescence. She realized that human behavior was not chaotic, but engineered, predictably guided by forces that most never suspected even existed. The diary described generations trained to respond without questioning. Fear, desire, loyalty, and shame were carefully calibrated, delivered in ways so subtle that the recipients believed them to be natural. History, law, and culture were rewritten, retold, and reshaped, not to inform, but to condition. And those who resisted, who questioned authority, who saw patterns, were quietly neutralized through social, economic, or psychological means, often leaving no trace that a lesson had been administered at all. It was here, in the orchestration of entire societies, that she understood the terrifying scope of the hidden powers. They did not rule by force alone. They ruled by shaping the very architecture of thought. From childhood, every individual was subtly guided into roles, behaviors, and beliefs that perpetuated the system. The diary's author argued that most people would never perceive the strings because the training was centuries in the making, perfected over time. Ignorance was not accidental, it was intentional. And then, for the first time, the diary asked her to act. It instructed her to repeat a phrase aloud, twice, as a symbol of engagement, alignment, and internalization. I see what others cannot. I see what others cannot. Saying it wasn't a charm, it explained. It was an acknowledgement of transformation, a moment of commitment to awareness and vigilance. By doing so, she was claiming participation, understanding, and responsibility for the truths she had uncovered. Her voice trembled, echoing in the attic as the words left her lips. The room seemed to shift, the shadows leaning closer, alive with acknowledgement. She felt the diary's presence grow stronger, almost sentient, testing, observing, recording her. She understood now. Knowledge was never neutral. To know was to be changed, to be watched, to be initiated into a reality most could never endure. The pages turned brittle under her fingertips, yet the words hit with the weight of iron. This section of the diary shifted tone, colder, more clinical, like the writer was no longer merely confessing, but documenting. As if he knew that one day, someone like her would read these entries and understand what the world refused to see. He spoke of experiments, not the kind whispered about in late-night conspiracies, but the kind that had already shaped the modern world without anyone realizing. Trials carried out on unknowing populations, psychological stress tests disguised as social trends, manufactured crises designed to measure compliance. He listed the dates, the locations, the outcomes, and the names of the orchestrators, names she recognized from history books, museums, and memorials. People revered as visionaries, pioneers, heroes. But here, in his own handwriting, He exposed them as architects of manipulation. He claimed that every generation was tested, observed, and measured by a select few who held no titles, appeared in no official directories, and lived outside the structures they controlled. They weren't presidents, generals, or executives. They were the quiet ones behind them, the ones who whispered instructions, the ones who chose which conflicts would begin and which movements would be allowed to thrive. They didn't need recognition. Influence was their oxygen. He described a moment in the 20th century when one of these orchestrators broke ranks, attempting to reveal the truth. The result was immediate, brutal, and invisible to the public. A sudden accident, a media storm, and a rewritten narrative that turned the rebel into a villain posthumously. It was a warning to others within the circle. Obedience wasn't expected, it was required. And betrayal was not punished with death alone, but with erasure, as if the person had never existed at all. As she read this, her breath grew shallow. She realized the writer didn't simply know these people. He had worked among them. He had witnessed their decisions firsthand. He was not an outsider documenting secrets. He was an insider documenting regret. Then a line appeared, standalone on the page, underlined with such pressure that it nearly tore the paper. Control is never taken. It is traded, by those who fear freedom more than they fear chains. That sentence struck her chest like a blow, because suddenly, she understood the true purpose of the diary. It wasn't just exposing manipulation, it was forcing her to see her own participation in it. For the first time in her life, she questioned not just the world, but herself. The diary grew almost conspiratorial, cataloging the lives of men and women whose influence spanned continents, yet left no trace in official history. She read of financiers, scholars, and politicians, figures whose public personas were admired, whose private actions were calculated to shape societies according to hidden agendas. Every decision they made, every alliance they formed, was part of a deliberate design to control thought, behavior, and perception. The diary revealed the truth behind revolutions, stock market collapses, wars, and treaties, outcomes carefully choreographed to maintain obedience, suppress knowledge, and consolidate influence. The author chronicled techniques of psychological warfare that were modern extensions of ancient methods. Media campaigns engineered to manipulate desire, fear, and belief. Public education restructured to channel attention toward conformity. Cultural events staged to normalize certain behaviors, to shape morality and preference without awareness. Entire populations were conditioned to respond in predictable ways, guided by forces that never announced themselves. She realized, with a chill, that most people were living inside an invisible maze, and the architects of this maze had never lost a game. What frightened her most was the personalization. The diary suggested that even her own thoughts, decisions, and perceptions had been quietly observed and measured. It hinted that subtle interventions had occurred in her life. Friends, mentors, opportunities, and obstacles all positioned to test, shape, or redirect her. Awareness was no longer a passive state. It was an initiation. The diary was teaching her to see the hidden scaffolding of the world, to recognize the unseen hands that moved history, and to anticipate their next moves. And then, as if to prove a point, the diary paused to describe a single orchestrated event, a public figure undone not by scandal alone, but by the careful alignment of perception, rumor, and fear. The lesson was clear. Manipulation was an art form, perfected over centuries, and mastery of this art required patience, insight, and the willingness to sacrifice morality for control. By the end of the section, she felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her mind. The diary had revealed that power was always invisible, always precise, and always absolute. And she understood, with an almost unbearable clarity, that knowing this made her both witness and participant in a game that spanned millennia. The diary shifted from grand conspiracies to the intimate, the personal. It revealed how manipulation penetrates even the closest bonds, family, friends, lovers, turning loyalty into leverage, affection into control. Every gesture, every word, every expectation could be engineered to shape behavior, to instill obedience, and to maintain secrecy. Love and trust, the diary suggested, were not exempt. They were instruments. She read accounts of parents conditioned to enforce subtle rules without realizing it, friends tasked unconsciously with monitoring one another, and lovers drawn into games of influence they could not articulate. People who believed themselves autonomous were often pawns in psychological systems centuries in the making. The diary argued that the human mind is malleable, and that manipulation is most effective when invisible, disguised as care, concern, or social expectation. It detailed techniques she recognized from her own life in retrospect, carefully timed praise and criticism, insinuations that planted doubt, repeated small tests of loyalty, orchestrated social pressure. At first, these tactics seemed minor, almost trivial, but the diary revealed the terrifying truth. Cumulative, these small nudges could reshape identity, choices, even morality. Obedience, it argued, is built not through force alone, but through relentless, invisible conditioning. And then came the most unsettling lesson. Awareness of these mechanisms does not make one immune. Recognizing manipulation merely shifts the battlefield inside the mind. She realized that every interaction she had ever experienced, friends' compliments, mentors' advice, lovers' words, could have been part of a system she had yet to fully perceive. The diary made her confront the uncomfortable possibility that autonomy itself was an illusion. By the end of the night, she understood the cruel brilliance of the system. The most potent control is subtle, invisible, and intimate. Fear need not be overt. It can reside in uncertainty, in expectation, in the quiet pressure to conform. And knowledge, once gained, can be as isolating as it is empowering. She felt the shadows of the attic stretch closer, almost sentient, as if acknowledging that she had now begun to perceive their design. The diary grew merciless, cataloging the fates of those who resisted. It described individuals who, upon glimpsing the machinery of control, refused to bend, refused to obey, refused to participate in the silent system. Their punishments were not always physical. Often, they were far more insidious. Isolation, erasure from memory, the subtle sabotage of relationships, careers, and reputations. A single misstep could set off a chain reaction, leaving the rebel ostracized, paranoid, and perpetually watched. She read of men and women who had been broken not by chains or billets, but by the careful orchestration of fate. Friends vanished. Families turned cold. Allies whispered doubts that eroded trust. The diary emphasized that the invisible architects of control didn't need to strike directly. They only needed to adjust the environment, guide perception, and wait. Resistance, in their eyes, was dangerous. But punishment had to be invisible, so that society continued to obey without questioning the price of defiance. And yet, there were those who survived. They did so not by strength, but by cunning, foresight, and adaptation. They learned to navigate the invisible currents, to anticipate manipulation, and, when necessary, to wield the tools of control themselves. Survival required embracing the knowledge fully, becoming a student and practitioner of the very forces that others feared. Moral compromise was unavoidable. Clarity came only through ruthless understanding. As she read, a cold dread settled over her. The diary had made it clear. Knowledge itself carries consequences. Seeing the hidden architecture of influence transforms the observer into a participant. To resist is to risk annihilation, social, psychological, or existential. To comply is to bear witness silently, and to internalize truths most could never confront. By the end of this section, she understood something irreversible. The machinery of manipulation was everywhere, inescapable, and patient. Once you see it, there is no turning back. And the cost of ignorance had always been far greater than the cost of awareness. The diary became instructional, detailing the path of those chosen, or willing, to join the hidden ranks. It described rituals designed not for worship, but for transformation. Initiates were subjected to exercises that rewired perception, sharpened awareness, and honed their ability to read, predict, and manipulate human behavior. Every ritual was a lesson: patience, observation, precision, and the mastery of subtlety over force. She read of exercises that tested loyalty, emotional resilience, and judgment under pressure. Initiates were isolated, watched, and prodded into recognizing patterns invisible to the untrained mind. Failures were quietly removed, memories erased or rewritten, ensuring that only those capable of full comprehension progressed. Success meant more than survival. It meant becoming part of a lineage of knowledge that shaped events, individuals, and entire societies without recognition or acknowledgement. The diary was explicit about the mechanics of influence. Subtle cues, Timing, repetition, and symbolism became tools. Language, gesture, and ritual were weapons. The goal was not domination through fear alone, but control so invisible it became indistinguishable from free will. Initiates learned to bend perception, redirect desire, and orchestrate behavior as naturally as breathing. The mastery of influence, the diary suggested, was not taught. It was awakened within those willing to pay the price of awareness. And then it revealed the final lesson. Mastery of others begins with mastery of oneself. Without absolute self-control, without rigorous discipline, the knowledge would consume the practitioner. The diary was clear. Power without understanding destroys more than it creates. Fear, desire, ambition, these forces must be understood, calibrated, and controlled within the mind before they can be wielded outside. By the end of this section, she realized the cruel symmetry of the diary's teaching. The same forces that manipulated millions could be mastered, but only by those willing to transform themselves into instruments of knowledge and control. Awareness was a weapon, and like all weapons, it required precision, patience, and sacrifice. The diary turned ceremonial, documenting actions that were as symbolic as they were instructive. Each ritual, each carefully orchestrated ceremony, served to reinforce the hidden structures of power and transmit knowledge across generations. These were not acts of religion or superstition. They were deliberate exercises in conditioning, loyalty, and the subtle assertion of authority. Symbols, gestures, and phrases carried meaning far beyond their appearance, encoding instructions, warnings, and recognition into those who witnessed them. She read of handshakes that marked allegiance, subtle changes in posture that signaled trust or suspicion, and phrases repeated in private gatherings that carried lessons invisible to outsiders. Architecture itself was part of the ritual. Halls, thresholds, and windows aligned to focus attention, to impress hierarchy, and to reinforce the perception of order. Every element was designed to teach perception, patience, and obedience simultaneously. The diary was meticulous in describing the interplay between ritual and psychology. Those who observed closely could absorb centuries of accumulated wisdom, internalize patterns of influence, and recognize the unseen architecture behind human behavior. The rituals were not meant to oppress, the diary claimed. They were meant to awaken the mind, to instill understanding, and to cultivate mastery. But mastery came at a price. The burden of knowing, the constant vigilance, and the awareness that secrecy is both shield and weapon. And then the diary revealed the most chilling lesson. These ceremonies were ongoing. They were not historical relics, but living practices. Every generation repeated them, perpetuating systems of control, influence, and observation, often without conscious awareness. Those who participated became both students and stewards of an invisible legacy, a lineage of knowledge and power that could not be escaped. By the end of this section, she understood the full weight of the system. Knowledge was not merely accumulated. It was encoded, performed, and enacted, binding mind to tradition, loyalty to secrecy, and awareness to responsibility. To witness was to participate, to understand was to inherit, and to forget was impossible. The diary had shown her the machinery, and now it demanded acknowledgement. The diary's tone darkened further, cataloging the methods used to punish failure or curiosity. Those who questioned the system, who hesitated or doubted, were not always met with violence. No, the architects of control preferred subtler methods, traps invisible to the untrained eye, designed to ensnare the mind before the body. Isolation, confusion, discrediting of allies, subtle manipulation of perception. The punishment was psychological, slow, precise, and nearly untraceable. She read of individuals whose lives had been rerouted by careful suggestion, careers destroyed by misdirection, reputations undermined through whisper campaigns, relationships twisted to sever trust. Fear was cultivated not through overt threat, but through uncertainty, ambiguity, and anticipation of catastrophe. The diary explained that the human mind is vulnerable to repetition, expectation, and pattern recognition, and that these vulnerabilities were exploited relentlessly. And the worst part, awareness alone did not protect you. The diary warned that knowledge of the system made resistance more dangerous. Those who saw the strings often became the targets, because their insight threatened the invisible order. Survival required cunning, subtlety, and the ability to anticipate manipulation before it struck. To fail was to disappear quietly, erased socially, emotionally, and sometimes even from history itself. The diary documented these traps with chilling precision, as if marking every lesson learned on the backs of those who had succumbed. She began to understand that the system was not cruel because it was capricious. It was cruel because it was meticulous. The architects didn't need to strike openly. They only needed to orchestrate the environment, guide perception, and wait. And when the trap closed, the mind often did the work for them. By the end of this section, she felt the weight of countless invisible snares pressing against her consciousness. Knowledge, she realized, was not freedom. It was a test. To see the system was to walk its corridors carefully, aware that a single misstep could mean isolation, destruction, or erasure. And the diary whispered, the shadows were patient, and they had always been watching. The diary shifted from revelation to instruction, as if the author now saw her readiness. Awareness, it said, is not a shield, it is a weapon. To survive the machinery of control, one must learn to perceive patterns before they are enacted, to anticipate influence before it arrives, and to manipulate subtly rather than react openly. Knowledge without action is useless. Insight alone cannot protect. The diary made this abundantly clear. She read of exercises meant to heighten perception, observing gestures, noting timing, decoding repetition in speech, and recognizing symbols embedded in everyday life. Every interaction carried information. Every decision carried hidden influence. The diary argued that mastering these subtleties allows one not only to survive but to bend circumstances to one's advantage, quietly, invisibly, and with precision. It emphasized patience. Power, it explained, is always slow, invisible, and cumulative. A single revelation, a single advantage, will not suffice. True survival requires vigilance over years, perhaps decades, to understand the layers of manipulation, to anticipate threats, and to discern allies from instruments. Awareness must be constant, deliberate, and unrelenting. And then it warned of temptation. The same knowledge that protects can corrupt. Those who wield insight without discipline become predators themselves, or worse, they are consumed by fear, obsession, or hubris. Mastery, the diary claimed, is impossible without the discipline to control one's own mind before attempting to influence another. By the end of the section, she realized that the diary was no longer just a record of horror. It was a manual for transformation. To read it was to inherit responsibility, to perceive, to act, and to survive. And in that realization, she understood that the world had always been a chessboard, and she had just been shown the moves. But the shadows were patient, and the game had only begun. The diary became almost relentless, detailing the subtle mechanisms by which society itself was engineered. Culture, education, media, all were tools, calibrated over centuries to influence thought, behavior, and loyalty. What people believed was free choice, curiosity, or moral judgment was often pre-programmed, a result of repetition, suggestion, and hidden narratives reinforced from birth. Every generation was conditioned to accept norms that served unseen agendas. She read how stories shaped perception, heroes and villains carefully crafted to instruct obedience, moral boundaries calibrated to guide behavior, myths repeated until they became instinctual. Education was no different. Curriculums were engineered to reward conformity, to elevate loyalty, and to instill fear of deviation. Even creativity, the diary argued, was constrained within invisible lines, producing innovation that never threatened the system's control. Media, too, played a silent but potent role. News, entertainment, and advertising were not neutral, they were instruments of influence. Repetition, framing, and emotional triggers directed thought and expectation, subtly guiding populations toward desires, fears, and loyalties beneficial to those who held power. People believed themselves free, but the diary made clear that their attention, reactions, and allegiances were anticipated, calculated, and shaped long before they consciously decided anything. And then came the cruelest lesson: the system is self-perpetuating. Those who internalize its lessons, often unknowingly, become enforcers, educators, and transmitters of influence themselves. Society sustains itself because its participants, conditioned from birth, are complicit. Awareness of this does not grant immunity. The world is designed to absorb the curious, reshape the rebellious, and reward the observant, but only if they understand the invisible rules. By the end of the section, she felt the oppressive scale of it. This wasn't manipulation by a few bad actors. It was architecture, centuries in the making, operating across families, institutions, and entire civilizations. And she understood, with a weight that pressed on her chest, to see the system is to enter it, and once entered, there is no neutral ground. The shadows were everywhere, patient and relentless. The diary's voice became instructive, even urgent. Knowledge alone was not enough. Awareness without mastery was vulnerability. To survive, and perhaps even thrive, within the hidden systems she now understood, she would have to transform herself. Her mind, her perceptions, her responses had to be refined with discipline, patience, and ruthlessness. The diary framed this transformation not as choice, but as necessity. She read of the first rule, self-mastery. Before influencing the world, one must control one's own fear, desire, and ego. The diary explained that unchecked emotions are exploitable. They make the mind predictable, the behavior readable, the individual vulnerable. The true student of hidden knowledge learns to observe impulses without yielding to them, to anticipate manipulation, and to act deliberately rather than react instinctively. The second rule was observation. To navigate the invisible currents of influence, one must see patterns others cannot. Gesture, tone, timing, symbols, all become data. Every interaction is a test, every conversation a clue. The diary argued that subtlety is survival. The ability to read both the seen and the unseen is the difference between dominance and destruction. The third rule, disciplined action. Awareness without application is useless. Knowledge must be translated into strategy, timing, and precision. Every word, every gesture, every decision must be weighed, calibrated, and, when necessary, deployed to protect oneself or influence outcomes. Hesitation is a luxury the world does not afford. By the end of this section, she felt the weight of expectation settle on her shoulders. The diary was no longer merely a record. It was a blueprint for evolution, demanding a transformation that would change her irreversibly. To understand the system was to inherit responsibility. To act within it was to claim power, and to refuse was to risk erasure. Awareness had become a burden, a weapon, and a mandate all at once. The diary revealed networks invisible to the untrained eye, hierarchies built not on titles, elections, or wealth, but on knowledge, loyalty, and subtle influence. Power, it argued, is never given. It is earned, observed, and transmitted silently. Bloodlines, mentorships, and allegiances create a lattice of control that spans centuries. Those within it recognize each other by ritual, symbol, and shared understanding, while the rest of the world remains oblivious. She read how influence is led. One level controls perception, another controls access, another shapes morality and belief. Each tier is disciplined, insulated, and tested. Failures are removed quietly. Successes are trained in secrecy, groomed to inherit not only authority but the responsibility of sustaining the system. Every generation reinforces the next, teaching observation, manipulation, and restraint with surgical precision. The diary described the mechanisms of transfer: symbols, rituals, secret communications, coded texts, and psychological conditioning. Knowledge itself is the currency. 2. Possess it is to wield power. To misunderstand it is to become prey. And always, the architects of influence observe. Mistakes are noted, patterns recorded, and potential threats neutralized before they act. It became clear to her that this hierarchy operates like an invisible organism. Decisions that appear spontaneous or benevolent are calculated, delays are orchestrated, and influence is exercised with patience. Individuals outside the system perceive only the surface, never understanding the deliberate architecture beneath. The diary warned, seeing the hierarchy is both a privilege and a burden. It transforms perception, alters relationships, and imposes responsibility. By the end of the section, she understood the subtle terror of legacy. Power is sustained not by force alone, but by the careful orchestration of perception, the cultivation of loyalty, and the quiet, relentless training of successes. The shadows she had begun to perceive were not chaotic. They were deliberate, patient, and infinitely persistent. And now, she was part of their observation. The diary traced the invisible threads that tied power to wealth, politics, and culture. It revealed mechanisms designed not to serve society, but to shape it. Banks, corporations, Media empires and political institutions were never neutral. They were instruments of influence, carefully aligned to enforce obedience, maintain hierarchy, and propagate the agendas of those who understood the system. Money, the diary said, is less a reward than a lever, and influence is more powerful than any law. She read how financial crises, policy shifts, and economic bubbles were orchestrated, not accidental. Panic, desire, and scarcity were tools to guide behavior, to select winners and punish dissenters. Cultural narratives were synchronized with economic manipulation, ensuring that the public consumed the lessons without realizing it. Symbols in art, entertainment, and ritual were woven into the fabric of everyday life, reinforcing loyalty, fear, and conformity with subtle precision. The diary revealed the orchestration of politics as theater. Leaders are often selected not for vision, but for compliance with hidden agendas. Scandals, promotions, elections, all manipulated to maintain the equilibrium of control. Media amplified the desired narrative while masking the mechanics of influence. Citizens believed themselves participants in democracy, yet they were often playing roles assigned centuries before they were born. And the diary emphasized the personal cost for those who perceive the system. Awareness isolates. Relationships are tested. Trust becomes weaponized, and every decision carries the weight of observation. Survival requires a mastery of subtlety, foresight, and patience. To see the levers is to inherit responsibility. To ignore them is to risk being crushed beneath them. By the end of this section, she understood that power is not merely held, it is choreographed. Every social, financial, and cultural current is guided with intention, and those who comprehend the patterns are faced with a choice: adapt, wield, or be consumed. Knowledge was no longer optional. It had become a weapon, a burden, and a calling. The diary's pages grew methodical, dissecting society like a living organism. It revealed how populations are conditioned from birth to accept authority, ritual, and hierarchy without question. From childhood, stories, lessons, and symbols encode obedience, fear, and loyalty. Repetition, ceremony, and narrative shape perception, guiding desire and moral judgment before cognition has fully matured. By the time an individual believes they are free, they have been meticulously sculpted to serve the unseen architects. She read how belief is maintained through cycles of reward and punishment, visibility and concealment, social pressure and isolation. Education cultivates compliance. Media reinforces emotional triggers and priorities. Cultural rituals normalize hierarchy and obedience. And when someone begins to resist, the system adapts, deploying subtle psychological pressures, peer influence, social ostracism, even internalized guilt, to redirect behavior without confrontation. The diary detailed the generational scope of this conditioning. Norms, taboos, and rituals are passed down silently, encoded into families, communities, and institutions. It argued that rebellion is rarely violent because it is anticipated. The system is designed to absorb, neutralize, and redirect dissent before it becomes a threat. Fear is quiet but pervasive, cultivated as instinct rather than instruction, and most obey without realizing why. She realized the terrifying precision. The population itself becomes the instrument of its own control. Awareness of the conditioning does not erase it. It merely shifts the battlefield to the mind. And yet, the diary whispered a dangerous truth. Those who perceive the patterns can resist, manipulate, and even shape outcomes, if they are willing to embrace the discipline and cunning required. Knowledge is both salvation and burden. By the end of the section, she understood the scale of the system. Entire societies, nations, and generations had been molded into obedience and expectation. And now, with the diary in her hands, she was no longer just an observer. She had crossed into the realm of participation, her mind both weapon and target in a game that had been centuries in the making. The diary grew almost confessional, revealing a truth more terrifying than any manipulation or hidden hierarchy. Knowledge is a double-edged sword. To see clearly is to be transformed. To perceive the patterns behind society, history, and human behavior is to inherit both power and unbearable responsibility. Awareness is not neutral. It changes perception, reshapes morality, and isolates the mind from the comfort of ignorance. She read of the temptation that accompanies insight. Once you understand influence, obedience, and control, you can wield it. But the diary warned that wielding without discipline corrupts absolutely. Pride, desire, and fear of being powerless are constant threats. Those who succumb to temptation often become indistinguishable from the very forces they once opposed. Knowledge carries its own poison. The more you see, the more you are tempted to shape, manipulate, or dominate, and the more the world weighs on your conscience. The diary described the burden of vigilance. Once you perceive the hidden currents, you cannot unsee them. Every interaction becomes a test, every gesture a potential trap, every institution a tool or weapon. You are forced to navigate constantly, anticipate deception, and measure every word and action. Even relationships are tactical exercises. Freedom becomes awareness, and awareness becomes duty. And yet, the diary insisted, there is a path. Discipline, patience, and self-mastery allow one not merely to survive, but to wield influence with precision, to protect oneself and guide outcomes without falling prey to corruption. The choice is stark: ignorance, which offers safety but leaves one vulnerable, or knowledge, which grants power but demands vigilance, cunning, and sacrifice. By the end of this section, she understood the cruel symmetry of it. Knowledge transforms you into a participant in a system you cannot ignore. It grants vision but isolates the soul. It offers mastery but demands rigor. And in the attic shadows, she felt the weight of that truth pressing down, knowing that once claimed, such understanding cannot be returned, ever. The final pages of the diary were almost silent, but their weight pressed heavier than any revelation before. The words, fewer now, demanded more than reading. They demanded reckoning. The author spoke of inevitability. Once you see the system, once you understand the hierarchies, manipulations, and hidden levers of power, you are forever changed. You cannot return to ignorance. You cannot unsee what has been revealed. Knowledge is no longer a choice. It is a mandate. She read the closing instructions carefully, as if the author had anticipated her hesitation. Vigilance must be constant. Observation relentless. Discipline unyielding. The diary insisted that the individual who embraces awareness becomes both hunter and hunted, observer and participant, protector and instrument. Every decision carries weight. Every interaction carries risk. The world she thought she knew was gone. The real world was hidden, led with intent, and alive with unseen forces that measure, guide, and manipulate relentlessly. And then the final warning: power is a mirror. Those who wield knowledge without self-mastery are devoured by it. Those who refuse to act are consumed by the currents of control. Survival, mastery, even morality are contingent upon understanding the rules, anticipating the moves, and accepting the isolation that comes with perception. Once you see clearly, every choice is irreversible, every alignment carries consequence, and every step must be deliberate. As she closed the diary for the last time, a profound transformation settled into her bones. Fear had shifted into awareness. Curiosity had sharpened into vigilance. Knowledge had become both burden and weapon. She understood that the world she had lived in was a carefully constructed illusion, and she had crossed a threshold into the hidden architecture that shapes humanity. The attic felt alive, almost sentient, as if the shadows themselves recognized her understanding. And in that silence, the diary left her with one final, inescapable truth. To know is to be changed, to perceive is to inherit responsibility, and to ignore what you now see is to risk being consumed by the very system that has observed countless generations before you. She was no longer just a reader. She had become a participant, and the game had only just begun.